So Evelyn's not got long, huh? Can't say I'm not looking forward to our windfall. Life's about to get easier, don't you think? Scott's words, cold and casual, hit me like a truck. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, stunned. We were at the dinner table, like any other weeknight, except this time my husband had revealed his true nature with one callous sentence. "What did you say?" I asked, hoping desperately that I'd misheard him. Scott chuckled. "Oh, come on, Lana. Don't pretend you're not thinking the same thing. Your mom's got some good money saved up. Once she passes, it's ours for the taking." I set my fork down, hands trembling. "How could you say that? My mother is gravely ill and you're eyeing her money like a vulture?" Scott shrugged and shoveled another bite of potatoes into his mouth. "No point being all sentimental about it. Evelyn's had a good long life. We've got big plans and that inheritance will set us up nicely." "You're unbelievable," I whispered. "That inheritance is my dying mother's life savings." "Exactly," Scott said pointedly. "It's just sitting there, waiting for the rightful owners to make use of it. And, honey, I'm ready to start living the good life." I sat back, stunned. The man I had married was a stranger to me. During our 4 years together, Scott had always been charming and affectionate. I couldn't reconcile this cold opportunist with the doting boyfriend who had tenderly nursed me through my father's death. But now his facade had slipped. Behind the dimpled smile and witty banter, Scott was utterly self-serving, with no empathy or compassion. "How long have you been waiting for this?" I asked quietly. "For my mother to die so you can get your hands on her money?" Scott leaned back and regarded me with amusement. "Come on, Lana, we've had to scrape and pinch pennies for years now. Don't you want more for us, for our future family? Your mom's had her time. Now it's our turn." I pushed my chair back sharply and stood up. My mother devoted her life to me and my father. She worked tirelessly to build that savings for her retirement, not so you could swoop in like a vulture and steal it. Scott rolled his eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. I'm just being practical." "Is that why you've been visiting her so often lately?" I demanded. "Bringing flowers and gifts, all while counting down the days?" Scott shrugged, unaffected. "I'm just trying to stay on Evelyn's good side. Make sure she remembers her dear son-in-law when it comes time to sign the will." Revulsion roiled inside me. Had Scott married me just to get close to my mother's money? How had I never realized until now what a cold, calculating opportunist he was? "You won't see a dime," I said through gritted teeth. "I'll make sure of it." Scott's eyebrows shot up in amusement. "Careful, Lana," he said in a low voice. "You really want to fight me on this?" I held his gaze unflinchingly. "For my mother? Absolutely." Scott's facade of charm melted away entirely, leaving only a sinister sneer. "Your mistake," he said coldly. "I'm getting what I deserve from Evelyn one way or another. Don't get in my way." He shoved back his chair and stalked out, leaving me shaken to my core. I collapsed into my seat, heart pounding with adrenaline and fury. The man I loved had never really existed. And now an enemy slept down the hall from me, scheming to rob my elderly mother's final days of peace and security. I had to stop Scott, but how? The next morning I avoided Scott, as I quietly got ready for work. My mind reeled from the revelation of his true nature. I had fallen for his charm and affection, blind to the opportunist lurking beneath. Looking back now, the signs had been there all along. When we first met, Scott had seemed captivated by me. He remembered every detail I shared, from my favorite flowers to my childhood dreams. He'd bring me small but thoughtful gifts and gestures I adored. I'd never felt so cared for. But it wasn't long before the gifts came with expectations attached. Scott would get moody if I didn't reciprocate enough praise or affection. Minor spats turned into screaming accusations of ingratitude. After the tempest, Scott would apologize profusely, promising to be better, convincing me the fights were my fault. When my mother had the first of many strokes, Scott seemed to transform into the dutiful, caring son-in-law overnight. He accompanied me on visits, bringing home-cooked meals, flowers, even sentimental photo albums for us to page through with Mom. I was touched by his compassion. Now I realized it had all been an act, a ploy to get close to my vulnerable mother. Scott charmed her just as he had charmed me, convincingly playing the part of the loving, concerned son. Meanwhile, his habits became increasingly selfish at home. Once easygoing and relaxed, Scott got easily frustrated and angry about small issues. He started going out drinking more nights than not, stumbling home in the early hours. Our sex life diminished to an occasional utilitarian encounter when Scott was in the mood. I wrote off his changes in behavior to work stress. I redoubled my efforts to please him, hopeful my affection could bring back the man I first fell for. It never did. The promise of my mother's inheritance must have convinced Scott to keep up his charade. But now that her health was rapidly declining, he saw no need to pretend any longer. The veneer had come off, and the ugly truth was undeniable. I was shaken from my reverie by the sound of Scott's footsteps downstairs. I steeled myself and went to confront him before leaving for work. He was gulping down coffee in the kitchen, dressed for his sales job. When I entered, his mouth curved into a sarcastic smile. "So still pouting about our little conversation last night?" he asked mockingly. "Our conversation opened my eyes," I said coldly. "You won't get a penny of my mother's money." Scott snorted. "Oh, please. You really think you can stop me from getting what I deserve?" "You deserve nothing," I snapped. "You married me under false pretenses. You charmed my mother only to profit from her illness. You're not getting away with this." Scott stepped towards me, his smile vanishing. His hand shot out and clamped around my wrist in a painful grip. "Tess, let's get one thing clear," he hissed, all traces of humor gone. "You can't stop this from happening. That money is as good as mine. If you even try to interfere, you'll regret it." He squeezed harder, twisting my arm. I gasped at the sudden pain. "I'm glad we understand each other," Scott said smugly. He released me and stepped back. "Now, be a good girl and stay out of my way." He brushed past me towards the door. Nursing my throbbing wrist, I listened to the slam of the front door. Hot tears pricked my eyes, but I forced them back. Scott had shown me his true colors. I'd be damned if I let him write me off as a docile, obedient wife. For my mother's sake, I had to find a way to stop him. With Scott gone, I got ready to pay Mom a visit. Seeing her gentle face strengthened my resolve. I wouldn't let Scott's greed taint her last days. Somehow, I had to gather evidence of Scott's intentions before it was too late. My mother's well-being and my future depended on it. I arrived at my mother's small cottage, nestled in a quiet neighborhood. Getting out of the car, I steeled myself for the possibility of seeing Scott's car parked outside. Sure enough, his shiny BMW was conspicuously parked in the driveway. Anger simmered inside me. Scott was likely in there right now, deceiving my mother with his usual facade of a caring, dutiful son-in-law. I entered quietly through the front door. Muffled voices drifted from the living room. I moved towards them, keeping out of sight. "So with the market downturn, work's been tough lately," I heard Scott say in a somber tone. "The medical bills haven't helped either. But I can handle it, Evelyn. Don't you worry about me." "Oh, Scott, I had no idea," came my mother's gentle voice, full of concern. "Please, take this and pay those bills. I can't have you burdened like this." "No, I couldn't possibly," Scott replied, feigning reluctance. "I insist. I want to help however I can." Red-hot fury surged through me as I realized what was happening. Scott was manipulating my mother's kind heart, making her feel guilty to extract money. I stepped into the living room. "What a touching scene," I said coldly. Scott and my mother both jerked their heads toward me in surprise. Scott's eyes narrowed while my mother smiled. "Lana, dear, what a lovely surprise." I moved forward and kissed her cheek, then turned a hard stare on Scott. He quickly composed himself, morphing into the mask of the caring son-in-law once more. "Evelyn was just helping me out with a little financial issue," Scott said lightly. "Wasn't that thoughtful of her?" "Yes, Evelyn has always been thoughtful and generous," I said sharply, "unlike some people I know." My mother glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension simmering beneath the surface. An awkward silence fell. "Well, I should get going. But thank you again, Evelyn," Scott said smoothly. "I'll be sure to visit again soon." He leaned down and pecked her cheek. As he walked out, he shot me a subtle, threatening glare. I waited until I heard the front door close behind him before turning to my mother. "What was that about, dear?" she asked, confused. "Scott said he's been having some troubles, so I offered to help." "Scott lied," I said angrily. "He doesn't need money. He's just manipulating you." My mother looked shocked. "What? But he's always been so good to us." I shook my head bitterly. "It was all an act, Mom. Scott married me, hoping to get his hands on your savings." As gently as I could, I explained Scott's callous words about anticipating her passing. My mother listened, distress crossing her kind features. "I can't believe it," she said softly. "He seemed so sincere, so caring." "It was just a facade," I said, taking her hand. "He won't get away with this. I'm going to expose him." Over the next few weeks, I set my plan in motion. I avoided Scott and brushed off his phony attempts at reconciliation. Meanwhile, I stayed close to my mother, making sure Scott couldn't get her alone. Sure enough, his visits became more frequent and urgent as his desperation grew. One evening, I stopped by the cottage unexpectedly. I found Scott bellowing at my sobbing mother, threatening to leave me if she didn't hand over more money. The sight hardened my resolve. After Scott left, I discovered the worst of his offenses. The antique watch passed down from my mother's late husband, her most treasured possession, was missing from her dresser. Scott had stolen and sold it without a second thought. If I had any doubts about exposing Scott, they evaporated in that moment. He had gone too far. To get justice for my mother, I now knew I would need to tear Scott's perfect facade apart for the world to see. The day I buried my mother was gray and gloomy, fitting for the crushing grief and anger festering inside me. After the theft of her watch, Mom's health rapidly deteriorated. The betrayal had broken something in her. She lost her appetite and became withdrawn. Within weeks, she was gone. According to her will, I inherited the modest cottage and savings she had left. Scott got exactly nothing, as I knew my mother had intended. He kept up the facade of the mourning son-in-law, but I saw flashes of resentment and frustration cracking through. At the funeral reception, Scott stuck close to me with cloying sympathy. "I can't imagine what you're going through," he murmured, squeezing my shoulder. "Let me know what I can do to help you through this difficult time." I shrugged his hand off coldly. "You've done enough. Your help is neither needed nor wanted." Scott's eyes narrowed, but he quickly composed himself with a somber nod. "Of course. My apologies." Throughout the reception, various relatives and friends offered their condolences and support. Most meant well, but their platitudes rang hollow. They hadn't truly known the strong, compassionate woman my mother was. Not like I had. One conversation, however, shook me from my bitter reverie. "We're so sorry about Evelyn," my Aunt Nadia said gently. "She was always there for us, especially after Frank's cancer diagnosis. We'll never forget her generosity and kindness." Frank, my uncle, nodded. "She even helped us pay off some crushing medical bills last year. We can never repay her for that." I stared at them, a horrible realization dawning. The financial help my mother had given Scott, it hadn't been from her savings. She had taken out loans and borrowed money from family to satisfy Scott's insatiable greed. Rage boiled inside me. The money Scott had conned my mother out of had been meant for her retirement, her health care, her final comforts. Instead, she had sacrificed it all because of his manipulation and deceit. I had guessed the depths of Scott's selfishness and cruelty. But this was unforgivable. "Please excuse me," I choked out, turning blindly away from my startled aunt and uncle. I strode down the hall, my grief mixing with blazing fury. Scott had hastened my mother's demise and fleeced her in her final days. I couldn't let him get away with it. In the quiet of my childhood bedroom, a plan began taking shape. When Scott had sold my mother's watch behind her back, he hadn't realized I was friends with the antique dealer he'd sold it to. I still had that connection. And fortuitously, the life insurance payout from my mother's policy had been substantial. Much more than Scott had managed to siphon from her. Tomorrow, I would contact my dealer friend and have him track down the heirloom watch. I would pay any price to get it back. With the watch secured, I could focus on the main event, exposing Scott spectacularly at the will reading. I envisioned the shock and humiliation on his face when his deceit was dragged into the light. When everyone he had worked so hard to deceive finally saw his true colors. The only detail left was how to lure Scott to the climax I would orchestrate. He would suspect something was amiss if I openly confronted him beforehand. No, I had to catch him off guard for the reveal to land with maximum impact. In that moment, the solution came to me. I took a deep, fortifying breath and made a phone call. "Scott? It's me. I just wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier," I said, forcing an unsteady tone. "Losing Mom has been so hard, but I shouldn't have taken it out on you." "Of course I understand," came Scott's soothing reply, though I could hear the eagerness in his voice. "This is a difficult time for us both." I took a shaky breath. "You're right, which is why we need each other now more than ever. Please come home tonight so we can talk." "I'll be there soon," Scott promised. As I ended the call, a cold smile of satisfaction crossed my lips. The trap was set. Scott had taken the bait. Now all I had to do was spring it on him when he least expected. At long last, justice would be served for my mother's suffering. And I would take back my life from the deceitful stranger I'd mistakenly married. The time had come to take Scott down. The day of my mother's will reading arrived. I took extra care getting ready, ensuring I looked composed and dignified. The time had come to put my plan into motion. I arrived early at my mother's lawyer's office. I handed him the antique watch discreetly, along with instructions for the dramatic reveal I had scripted. He nodded solemnly. Right on time, Scott arrived, wearing a somber suit and an expression to match. "Ready for this, darling?" he murmured to me, squeezing my shoulder. His anticipation was thinly veiled beneath the veneer of the grieving son-in-law. I gave him a tight smile and nodded. We took our seats across from the lawyer, who began reading out the preliminary clauses in a formal tone. As expected, the cottage and modest savings were left to me. Scott's composed expression barely flickered, though his fingers rapped on the armrest impatiently. "As per Evelyn's specific instructions," the lawyer continued, "the following item is bequeathed to her daughter, Lana." He reached into his desk and withdrew the antique watch. My heart swelled at the sight of the delicate timepiece, once again where it belonged. Scott jerked upright in his seat, eyes fixed on the watch. "No, that can't be right," he blurted out. Keeping my tone casual, I said, "This watch was one of Mom's most treasured possessions. I gave it to the lawyer for safekeeping until after the will reading." "But I thought," Scott sputtered. His facade was cracking as panic set in. "You thought what, Scott?" I asked mildly. Before he could collect himself, I turned to the lawyer. "Could you tell us, please, the details of how you came to have this watch?" The lawyer nodded. "Of course. Yesterday I received a phone call from a Miss Lana. She informed me this family heirloom had been sold without her mother's consent shortly before her passing. Miss Lana asked me to use the provided funds to locate and repurchase the watch, which I was able to do from the antique dealer." Scott's face had gone pale. "Now wait just a minute," he began angrily. "Furthermore," I smoothly cut him off, "Miss Lana reported that the unwarranted sale had been perpetrated by a Mr. Scott Davidson for his own financial gain." I watched Scott freeze at the mention of his name, his eyes wide with shock and rage. "Lies, all lies," he sputtered. But the lawyer ignored him, pushing forward the papers he had prepared. "Indeed, Mr. Davidson's signatures on these documents confirm he sold the watch, pocketing a significant sum." He passed the papers to me. I made a show of looking them over and shaking my head sadly. "How could you?" I asked Scott bitterly. "This heirloom meant everything to Mom. You knew that, and you sold it behind her back anyway." Scott leapt to his feet. "I don't know what nonsense you've concocted, but no one will believe you over me," he yelled desperately. "Oh, I think they will," I said calmly. On cue, the lawyer opened the door, and my aunt, uncle, and several other trusted family members filed in. Scott's eyes bulged in dismay. As my makeshift jury took their seats, I rose to address them. "Thank you all for coming. I asked you here to finally reveal Scott's lies and deceit." I proceeded to lay out exactly how Scott had manipulated my mother, siphoning away her savings while pretending to be a caring son-in-law. I concluded by handing over the damning paperwork as Scott stood helpless and fuming. By the end, the contempt toward Scott was palpable. Murmurs of "gold digger" and "disgusting" filled the room. Scott shouted fruitless denials, but no one paid him any mind. His fate had been sealed. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile before turning my back on him decisively. The look of disbelief and impotent rage on his face was sweeter than I had imagined. My revenge was complete. Now I could move forward on my own terms, unburdened by manipulation and greed. I had reclaimed my life and my mother's legacy. The future looked bright again. The day after the will reading, I arrived early at the funeral luncheon to ensure everything was in place. This would be the climax of my plan to publicly expose Scott. I had spent weeks gathering irrefutable evidence of Scott's misdeeds. Today, with our family and friends as witnesses, I would finally unveil the ugly truth for all to see. Right on schedule, Scott walked in with his signature charm dialed up to full force. He mingled seamlessly, embracing relatives and shaking hands with an easy smile. I kept my distance, letting him have his last shining moments. Once all the guests had arrived, I tapped my glass to get everyone's attention. Conversations quieted as all eyes turned to me. Scott froze mid-laugh, his confident expression wavering. "Thank you all for being here," I began, voice clear and steady. "Before we eat, I'd like to say a few words about my mother and the man who deceived her." Murmurs rippled through the room. Scott paled, taking an unsteady step towards me. "Lana, dear, I'm not sure this is the time." "Oh, I think this is the perfect time," I said coolly. Scott recoiled at the steel in my tone. I proceeded to methodically outline Scott's ploys to isolate and manipulate my mother. I recounted her report of missing money and valuables in the months before her death. I described Scott's volatile behavior behind closed doors when his demands weren't met. With every damning detail, Scott shook his head and sputtered out reflexive denials. But the gasps and dark looks from the crowd silenced him. I had them hook, line, and sinker. Building to a crescendo, I withdrew the antique watch from my purse. This heirloom belonged to my mother's late husband. It was her most prized possession, and Scott, my own husband, stole and sold it without her knowledge. A chorus of outraged exclamations erupted at the sight of the watch. My Aunt Nadia cried out in recognition. Scott stood frozen, jaw working wordlessly. I held up a hand for silence. But the person Scott underestimated most was my mother herself. I unfolded a sheet of paper containing her last note to me. "My dearest Lana," I read aloud, "if you are reading this, I regret that I could not shield you from the truth about Scott's greed and duplicity. You deserved so much better than the hand you were dealt. But I know your strength, courage, and conviction. Though my time is ending, yours is just beginning. Shed this burden weighing you down and walk forward boldly into a future you forge yourself. All my love, Mom." A hush fell over the room. I refolded the note carefully and turned a piercing gaze on Scott. "You showed my mother no decency as she was dying, but she knew the truth would prevail in the end. Your lies end here." Absolute fury blazed across Scott's features. He surged toward me, hand raised threateningly. "You lying bee." Two of my uncles grabbed him before he could reach me, subduing him with ease. My Aunt Nadia then delivered the final blow. "Scott Davidson, get out of this house immediately," she commanded. "You are not welcome here again." Scott thrashed uselessly in my uncle's grip. Realizing he was beaten, he shot me a look of deepest loathing. "This isn't over," he hissed. With a heave, he broke free and stormed out the door. A profound silence hung over the room. Then my aunt hugged me, whispering, "Your mother would be so proud." I had done it. Against all odds, I had ripped away the veil and exposed Scott for the deceitful, greedy monster he was. Now everyone close to us knew the truth. Scott's web of charming lies had been demolished. My mother and I had been avenged. Now my future truly lay open before me, full of hope and light. In the weeks after I publicly exposed Scott, the repercussions were swift and severe. He was fired from his job once his employers learned how he had heartlessly fleeced my vulnerable mother. My Aunt Nadia notified the police, who launched an investigation into Scott's financial abuses. Soon it became clear that the money Scott had wheedled out of my mother was long gone, pocketed or squandered on gambling, alcohol, and designer clothes for his mistresses. My Uncle Frank helped me file a lawsuit to seize Scott's remaining assets to recoup some of what was stolen. Throughout the ordeal, I refused to see or speak to Scott. The investigators attempted to reach out to arrange a meeting. But one day, I glimpsed a familiar BMW parked down the street from my cottage. Scott was clearly under orders not to contact me directly. But despite the restrictions placed on him, he refused to leave me in peace. The realization made my skin crawl. I quickly moved to upgrade the cottage security. One evening, I arrived home to find Scott lying in wait by my front door. Before I could react, he accosted me with a barrage of venomous threats. "You ruined my life, you vindictive bitch," he spat, blocking my way. "I'll make you pay for what you've done." Heart-pounding, I managed to push past him and get inside safely. As I hurriedly locked the door, Scott pounded furiously on it. This isn't over, Lana. I'll take back what's mine, no matter what it takes. You'll be sorry, he bellowed. When his tirade finally ended, I sat shaking with leftover adrenaline. The detectives had clearly underestimated what Scott was capable of in his desperation. I filed for an emergency restraining order first thing the next morning. Despite Scott's threats, his downfall continued. The lawsuit stripped him of his remaining assets, leaving only a mountain of debts. Sympathetic friends and relatives soon vanished, unwilling to be associated with his toxicity. Part of me wondered if I should feel sympathy for the pariah Scott had become. But any doubts evaporated when the detectives uncovered yet another of his despicable acts. While visiting my mother at the end, Scott had convinced her to add him to the deed for her cottage. He planned to evict me from my childhood home the minute he gained control. The cunning manipulations knew no end. As the evidence mounted against Scott, I regained some measure of peace. My mother's money and home were back in my hands, safe from his grasping deceit. The cottage began to feel like a sanctuary once more. On a quiet afternoon, I was reading a book on the back patio when the detectives pulled up. As they exited the car, I steeled myself for more bad news, but instead they were smiling. "It's over," the lead detective said. "Scott took a plea deal. He'll be serving up to 5 years for elder abuse and fraud." Relief washed over me. Scott would be gone from my life for years, unable to hurt or manipulate anyone else. Justice had been served. That night, I toasted my mother's photo. "We did it," I whispered. Her possessions were once again secure, her legacy preserved, and her deceitful abuser was paying the price. I hoped that somehow she knew her daughter had prevailed. Wiping away a few bittersweet tears, I headed to bed with a full heart. Tomorrow marked a fresh start and a chance to plan for my future, unburdened. Though Scott had stolen time from us I could never get back, he no longer had any power over me. I slept deeply and dreamlessly that night, feeling freer than I had in years. Morning broke bright and clear outside my window. A new dawn was here, full of promise. The years following Scott's incarceration passed in a blur. I filled them with work, family, and travels, anything to keep moving forward. Occasionally I wondered what had become of Scott after his release, but I quickly banished those thoughts. That part of my life was over. On my 40th birthday, I decided to celebrate with a solo hiking trip in the mountains. The fresh air and stunning vistas were the perfect backdrop for self-reflection. One night at my campsite, I found myself thinking about how far I'd come. A decade ago, I had been trapped in a marriage built on lies, oppressed by Scott's deceit. Now here I was, strong, independent, and happy. Scott's schemes had cost my mother and me so much wasted time, but I had broken free. He no longer controlled my path forward. My mother had hoped I would walk boldly into my future, unburdened, and I had. Her encouragement had lit my way through the darkest times. As the fire crackled, I whispered into the night, "Your courage lives on in me, Mom, every day." Shortly after I returned from the trip, I received an unexpected call from my mother's old neighbor, Joan. She had been like family when I was growing up. "Lana, dear, I'm so glad I caught you," Joan said in her warm, familiar voice. "There's something you should know. It's about Scott." My pulse quickened anxiously. "What about him?" "Well, I probably shouldn't say anything, but I just thought you should know he's been in touch with your Aunt Nadia lately," she said uncertainly. I gripped the phone in shock. He contacted her? Why? What did he want? "I'm not sure exactly," Joan admitted, "but it seemed chummy enough that Nadia invited Scott and his new wife over for dinner next week." My mind reeled. Scott was back and inserting himself into my family again. Why wasn't Nadia keeping him at arm's length after everything he did? I realized with dread that Scott was adept at spinning his wicked deeds into sympathetic tales of redemption. He would slither his way back into my relatives' good graces if I didn't speak up. Well, not this time. I had come too far to let Scott unravel everything now. I thanked Joan for the information and got to work. I soon had statements from the investigators and lawyers detailing Scott's offenses. I copied relatives who had witnessed his behavior firsthand. Finally, I wrote to Aunt Nadia. "Dear Nadia, I know Scott's charisma makes it easy to forget the harm he's caused our family, but I refuse to let that happen again. Scott devastated our mother in life and death. His greed and deceit can't be erased with a pleasant dinner. You saw his true colors yourself. Please, I implore you not to welcome him back into our lives. For our family's sake, especially mother's, stand firm against Scott's schemes. Our loyalty and remembrance keep her spirit alive. With love, Lana. I had no illusions that a strongly worded email could single-handedly stop Scott. But it was progress that I spoke up at all. Old Lana had suppressed her outrage to keep the peace. Now my voice was strong, my conscience clear. Scott had taken so much, but he hadn't taken my courage. As long as I carried my mother's steely conviction, Scott couldn't control me. My future belonged to me and me alone. Scott was a footnote in someone else's story now. I continued on boldly, unfettered and unbowed.